When anyone tries to criticize the Pope in Catholic circles, they commit one common error, or I don't know if they commit this error or they're deceived by this one common error. And it's that they don't seem to realize that they're trapped in a circular argument that assumes what they're supposed to prove. This is true both for Protestants and for the so-called traditional Catholics who do the same thing that the Protestants did and continue to do. The assumption in the argument against the Pope, and whenever we talk about the Pope, we need to realize that the Pope is a living office. So we should be talking about the living, present Pope. Anytime Protestants or the so-called traditional Catholics talk about the Pope to criticize the Pope, they make an assumption that's never proven, never demonstrated. The assumption is that somewhere in the past there is a separation from what the Pope teaches and how the Pope judges and what the Pope does, and what popes did in the past, or what the apostles did in the past. There's an assumption that there's a separation where the Pope or a Pope began to do something that contradicted what was done before. And this point of departure or separation can never be provided. It can never be proven or shown. Where did it take place? What was the actual point of separation? There's never any demonstration of any such point. It's assumed to be true, and then that assumption drives the argument, but it's never proven. And so what we find is that men who desire to contradict or simply rebel against the Pope eagerly gobble up this assumption and then simply begin talking about things as if it's been proven when it has never been proven. Now, with the Protestants, their argument is that at some point in the past, a separation took place where the hierarchy of the Catholic Church departed from the content of sacred Scripture, where the Catholic Church began doing things that contradict sacred Scripture and are impossible in light of sacred Scripture. They cannot possibly be true. However, this point of departure is never provided. Where is the point where the hierarchy of the Catholic Church suddenly took off in a different direction? Where is this point? I'm going through a series of talks right now called The Catholic Church in the Book of Acts, and we can see as we go, line by line, chapter by chapter, that there's nothing but support for the Catholic Church. So if the Protestants would argue that the Catholic Church at some point in history separated from the teaching of the apostles in sacred Scripture, show us where that point is, because it's never been demonstrated. Now, that doesn't mean start with your own interpretation of the Christian message and show where the Church departed from your interpretation of the Christian message. The challenge for the Protestants is to show that what the Catholic Church teaches and does is contradictory to what the Scriptures teach, or is impossible in light of some necessary interpretation of sacred Scripture. All Protestants do is show that the Catholic Church doesn't agree with their interpretation and their system of religion or idea of salvation. Protestantism never shows that the Catholic position is repugnant to sacred Scripture or cannot possibly be reconciled with sacred Scripture. And this is the fault of their argument. They simply assume the conclusion that they're supposed to be proving. Now, what's even more difficult to comprehend is that in our generation, those who call themselves traditional Catholics are repeating the same exact error that the Protestants made. They're doing exactly what the Protestants did, but they're changing the source of the information that they say the hierarchy of the church has departed from. The Protestants said that the hierarchy of the church departed from sacred Scripture. And again, they've never demonstrated any such thing. But they argued that the departure was a movement away from the content of sacred Scripture. The traditional Catholics aren't crazy enough to suggest that the hierarchy of the church has departed from sacred Scripture. We know that that's the Protestant error. But what they do is they argue that there was something called tradition. There was apostolic tradition established throughout church history. And at some point, the hierarchy of the church departed from that tradition. So we simply replace tradition for Scripture, and we have the same argument. The conclusion that this actually took place, this departure actually took place, is assumed from the beginning by people who want to contradict or rebel against the Pope. But it's never proven that any departure ever took place. And again, we have an interpretation of tradition, and we can show that the Pope does not agree with one's interpretation of the tradition. But we cannot show that anything that the Pope does is repugnant to or impossible to reconcile with anything contained in sacred tradition. It's the same exact argument that the Protestants made, simply substituting tradition for Scripture. Now, the simplest way to prove, or I shouldn't say prove, the simplest way, I think, to introduce doubt into this argument is for those who criticize the Pope to realize that he was appointed to his office by bishops who were appointed by previous popes. And that has continued since the time of the apostles. Popes appointed bishops. Out of those bishops, they appointed cardinals. When a pope passed away, the cardinals appointed the next pope, and that pope appointed new cardinals and bishops, and the church has gone on in this way from the beginning. Every pope is connected to the previous popes. Every cardinal is connected to previous popes. Every bishop is connected to previous popes. So not only is there no demonstrable separation from anything taught or done in tradition, but the present popes are even chosen by past popes. And so this argument becomes really ridiculous, and the burden of proof is on those Catholics who would argue that some separation has taken place. The burden is to show that the current teaching and practices of the Pope and bishops in union with the Pope are impossible to reconcile with what was taught and done in the past. And this must be demonstrated. It can't merely be probable, because that would not be proof. That would not justify contradicting or disobeying the supreme ruler of the Catholic Church. And what we'll find is that no such demonstrative proof will be provided. The people arguing and criticizing the Pope, they're not even capable of providing demonstrative proof, as their arguments make clear. And the fact that they assume their conclusion and can't discern that that's what they're doing reveals the real quality of their thoughts. The fact that they share in the same exact method of arguing that the Protestants did, likewise, reveals the lack of quality in their thinking. We can be certain that there is no separation between the papacy and sacred scripture, or between the papacy and sacred tradition. For the living Pope and bishops in union with him are the only authoritative interpreters of both sacred scripture and sacred tradition. So this argument is impossible.